established the F.W. de Klerk Foundation. We wrote his autobiography together. Excellent book. I can strongly recommend it. I was pleasantly surprised when I was invited to address the Libertarian seminar, because I have been a long-time supporter of the Libertarian philosophy. Whenever I go to Washington, I generally drop in at the Cato Institute. I receive all Cato's material. I identify fully with the two documents that they have in their entrance hall. The one is a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and another is another document also published in 1776, and it is The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And I think that says it all. I want to speak today about freedom, the role that freedom plays in the development of societies, the role it is likely to play in 1989, the American academic Francis Fukuyama proclaimed that the end of history had arrived. If I may quote him, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." That was quite a claim. Fukuyama was saying that it was simply not possible to improve on the system of free market liberal democracy that had emerged victorious after the collapse of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1990s. After thousands of years of political development, mankind had finally aced it. If there was any point to the long and tragic story of war and conflict, it may have been to illustrate which approach of government worked best in advancing the well-being of humanity. This is a question that historians should explore. Aristotle dealt with it 2,400 years ago. For him, the best form of government was a monarchy, ruled by a single enlightened ruler. However, the worst form of government was its counterpart, a tyranny dominated by a single corrupt and unenlightened despot. The second best was an aristocracy, ruled by the enlightened elite, but it could morph into an oligarchy under the control of a corrupt and despotic clique. The third best, but the safest option, was a polity in which power was in the hands of the educated and uncorrupt electorate. But a polity could degrade into a democracy, the fourth best system, if the people were unenlightened and corrupt. Perhaps the greatest exponent of democracy in the century before Aristotle was the Athenian leader Pericles. In his famous funeral oration, he made the following observations. Our constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. When it is a question of settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. When it is a question of putting one person before another in positions of public responsibility, what counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which the man possesses. no one, so long as he has it in him to be of service to the state, is kept in political obscurity because of poverty. We give our obedience to those whom we put in positions of authority, and we obey the laws themselves, especially those which are for the protection of the oppressed, and those unwritten laws which it is an acknowledged shame to break. Pericles understood the benefits of free trade. As a result of Athens' greatness, he said, all good things from all over the world float into us, so that to us it seems just as natural to enjoy foreign goods as our own local products. He was also a social liberal. Again, he says, and just as our political life is free and open, so is our day-to-day life and our relations with each other. We do not get into a state with our next-door neighbor if he enjoys himself in his own way. So Pericles was, in fact, the first libertarian. For Aristotle, the critical issue was not so much who ruled, but whether those who ruled had the requisite integrity and ability. For Pericles, the key issues were political freedom, merit, and social tolerance. However, Athenian democracy was a flash in the pan. It was soon extinguished, and with a few exceptions, democracy did not reappear until the 18th century. Historians should also ask how two relatively small European powers, Britain and the Netherlands, managed to conquer far wealthier and populous societies in Asia from the 17th century onwards. An important factor was that by the end of the 17th century, both countries had successfully limited the power of their governments to interfere arbitrarily with the freedom and property of the emerging middle class. This meant that merchants could mobilize resources for the pursuit of trading ventures without the fear that despotic governments would seize a disproportionate part of their profits or interfere too onerously with their activities. Not surprisingly, the first national banks and stock markets were established in the Netherlands and England toward the end of the 17th century. Greater intellectual freedom went hand in hand with the advancement of economic and political freedom. Francis Bacon laid the foundations for the scientific method. The Royal Society was founded. Newton, Locke, Hooke, Boyle, Herschel, and Harvey vastly expanded the borders of man's understanding of himself and the universe. The Netherlands became the principal center for free thought in an otherwise intolerant Europe. Descartes, Spinoza, van Leeuwenhoek helped to lay the foundations for the Enlightenment. Chinese and Indian merchants and scientists did not enjoy similar advantages. At the beginning of the 15th century, under the Ming Yongle Emperor, China sent out treasure fleets under the command of Admiral Zheng Ze all over the Western Pacific and Indian Oceans. The fleets included more than 200 vessels, some of them among the largest wooden ships ever built. And they were manned by 28,000 men. They exceeded in size Columbus's tiny flotilla in 1492 by orders of magnitude. However, after 1433, Ming officials ordered the fleets to be confined to port, and closed China to the world. It was this lack of freedom from autocratic control that prevented China from realizing its full potential and that ultimately hobbled it in its ongoing competition with the West. That is why there was never a Chinese West European company. At the beginning of the 18th century, at the very time when it was conquering much of the rest of the world, Europe accounted for only 12% of global GDP, compared with the more than 45% generated by China and India. By 1913, following its emergence from the Industrial Revolution, Europe's share of the global GDP had risen to almost 30%, while the combined share of China and India had dropped to only 15%. The relative economic and intellectual freedom of Europe's emerging middle classes gave them a decisive advantage in their competition with other societies. During the last century, there were further cataclysmic struggles between societies with different systems, between the Western democracies and totalitarian regimes in Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The United States emerged victorious, on the one hand because of the enormous productive capacity of its free market economy, and on the other because of fatal mistakes that despots in closed, ideologically driven societies are inclined to make. For 45 years after World War II, the United States and its democratic allies were locked in a titanic struggle with the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact client states. It was a classic competition between economic, political, and intellectual freedom on the one hand, and rigid, totalitarian, socialist central planning on the other. At the beginning of the 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed beneath the weight of its palpable economic failures and political contradictions. Freedom had once again emerged as the uncontested winner on the battlefield of ideas. And there is reason for this victory. Freedom is empirically critical to the happiness, success, and prosperity of societies everywhere. Freedom is empowerment. In free societies, individuals can achieve their full potential without artificial constraints. Companies can generate wealth if they are freed from over-regulation and if they are unburdened by excessive taxation. Freedom of expression and information are essential for the advancement of scientific and technological knowledge. Free debate, the ability to criticize government policies and to expose wrongdoing and corruption are essential for good governance. Institutions, the media, religious organizations, and civil society can play their roles unlimited by government interference. Economic freedom is an essential aspect of freedom. It rests on the right of individuals and companies to own property, to compete freely in markets, and to make their own economic decisions. It has been proved to be a decisive factor also in the generation of wealth and social advancement. Nations that are economically free outperform non-free nations in all indicators of well-being. Countries in the top quintile in economic freedom have an average per capita GDP 10 times higher than those in the bottom quintile. Their average economic growth is 4 times higher. The average income in the poorest 10% of their populations is more than 5 times higher than that of the poorest 10% in the least economically free countries. Unemployment is 5.2% compared with 13% in the bottom quintile of non-free societies. Life expectancy is 77.7 years in the top quintile compared to 52.5 years in the bottom quintile. Deng Xiaoping's free market economic reforms in China that included recognition of property rights resulted in the greatest enrichment of the largest number of people in the shortest period in human history. In 1980, GDP per capita in China was less than $350. Now it exceeds $15,000. Freedom has also delivered the goods. During the past 74 years, mankind has made unparalleled progress. Global life expectation in 1945 was only 47 years. Now it is over 70, and a girl child born in Japan today has a life expectation of 107 years. 2/3 of the world's people now live in democracies, compared with less than 25% in 1976. Global poverty has been slashed from over 40% in 1980 to less than 14% now. Infant mortality has plunged. More than 90% of the world's population under the age of 25 can read and write. There has been a steady decline in the percentage of people who have died as a result of conflict. During the past 3 years, there has been an average of fewer than 150,000 conflict-related deaths each year. This is about 1/3 of the annual number of murders during the same period. Astounding progress has been made in virtually every area of human life. But what are the reasons for this progress? The first, I believe, was a revolution that occurred since 1945 in attitudes to basic human rights. We forget that only 120 years ago, racial, gender, and class discrimination were regarded as natural and acceptable facets of relationships between human beings. We forget that European nations believed that they had a manifest right to rule distant peoples. There were only 12 countries outside Europe that were never colonized. Before the First World War, many people still thought that war was a worthy national pursuit, and that it tested the moral and physical strength of nations. We forget that women who had not yet been given the vote experienced extreme discrimination in their personal and professional lives. We forget that Oscar Wilde landed in Reading jail. European nations were still riddled with class distinctions, manifested in the rigid stratification of society, which, strangely enough, we now enjoy revisiting in TV series such as Downton Abbey. After World War II, the liberal values that Western societies had long professed began to catch up with them. And in 1948, they found expression in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It proclaimed that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or any other status. The increasing observation of these rights has led to a fairer, freer, kinder, and more tolerant world for billions of people. The second factor that contributed to mankind's success since World War II was the unparalleled peace that we have enjoyed during this period. According to Steven Pinker, we may be living in the most peaceful time in our species' existence. The third reason was globalization. It led not only to the steady increase in international trade, but to new multilateral approaches to dealing with international relations. By 1910, the value of global trade in real terms was 30 times greater than it had been in 1945, generating enormous wealth all around the world. Organizations like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund brought order and cooperation into international trade and finance. Specialized agencies such as the International Civil Aviation Organization, the International Maritime Organization, and the Food and Agricultural Organization assured order and essential cooperation in critically important dimensions of international relations. It was against this background that Francis Fukuyama made his famous proclamation regarding the end of history. Well, of course, he was wrong. Following the 2008 global recession, the world lost confidence in the so-called Washington Consensus. Now it is all but dead. Even more concerning is the fact that the great drivers of human progress that I have just mentioned are under threat. Globalization is in trouble. Free trade is threatened by tariff wars and a reversion to protectionism. The trade war between the United States and China will result this year in a significant drop in international trade and in global economic growth. Since 2010, the exponential growth in international trade has stopped and begun to fall. The roles of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund are increasingly rejected by countries determined to avoid austerity measures. The United States, under President Trump, has walked away from important international commitments, such as the Paris Climate Agreement. Other leading economies, including China, Russia, and India, pick and choose from the international obligations with which they will comply. The Western tradition of liberal democracy is also in trouble. Elections have become competitions between parties promising more and more to voters, who can be just as corrupt as any other group endowed with power. The only way governments can possibly meet voters' expectations is by spending enormous amounts that they have to borrow from future generations, hence their unsupportable national debts. Throughout Europe and the United States, populists are adopting nationalist and even racist approaches. They are increasingly alienated from ruling elites and privileged bureaucracies, whom they suspect, probably quite rightly, regard them with contempt. At the same time, the worthy values of equality and non-discrimination have been weaponized into the toxic ideology of identity politics. Public discourse has been forced into a straitjacket. any politically incorrect statement or action, even if it was made 20 years ago, can become the subject of a Twitter storm and can bring an instant end to private and public careers. We are entering a new period of political conformity, the likes of which we have not witnessed since the 17th century. The demand for orthodoxy extends to key areas of science and public affairs. Any attempt to question the prevailing doctrines on issues such as climate change, immigration, or even Darwinism results in ostracism and the ruin of reputations. This is not simply a question of rhetoric. The new orthodoxies have resulted in major countries adopting potentially ruinous policies, such as the policy of Germany to get rid of its nuclear energy sector and to admit 1 million refugees. All this leads us to conclude that we have not become wiser or more tolerant with the passage of time. It is simply that the parameters of our folly and intolerance have shifted. Finally, we can no longer take the preservation of international peace for granted. Everywhere, the geostrategic tectonic plates are shifting, and they're shaking the foundations of peace and stability that we have enjoyed for the past 75 years. As Napoleon warned, the Chinese giant has awoken from its slumber and is flexing its muscles. It is projecting its economic and political power as far south, as far as Southern Europe through its Belt and Road Initiative. It is turning its hungry eyes toward Africa and the continent's enormous mineral, economic, and agricultural potential. And we must remember that there are fewer people in the 21 million square kilometers of sub-Saharan Africa than there are in the 3.5 million square kilometers of India. Russia, still smarting from the collapse of the Soviet Union, has replaced communism with nationalism as its guiding ideology, but has retained its traditional autocracy. It has the capacity and the will to influence developments in a vast swath of the Eurasian landmass in the Middle East. The United States shows signs of entering one of its cyclical stages of introspection and non-involvement in global affairs. The recent withdrawal of American troops from Syria may be a very important indication of this. Europe is divided and weak. 74 years of peace and prosperity have led to the complacency and debility which Ibn Khaldun warned was the destiny of the second and third generations in civilized states. There are a number of points along the shifting tectonic plates where conflict might erupt, including the Western Pacific, where China will not indefinitely endure US naval supremacy. The South China Sea, where China appears to be intent on imposing its irrational territorial claims. Taiwan, particularly if there's any further move toward independence. The Baltic states and Ukraine, if Russia senses any lack of resolve on the part of the European Union and the United States. The India-Pakistani clash over Kashmir, and the ever-present and unresolvable tensions in the Middle East, in Israel, Palestine, and the growing confrontation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. One of the fallouts of a new period of US isolationism might be a rush by countries that currently rely on the American nuclear shield to acquire their own nuclear deterrence. All this would increase the risk of a catastrophic nuclear mistake. I recently had lunch with the representative of one of the East Asian countries, and I said, I thought that if the Japanese feared that the Americans would no longer provide them with essential protection, that they would be able to produce their weapons within 2 weeks. He disagreed strongly. He said, no, that's not true. 24 hours. However, at the center of the geostrategic stage will be the growing struggle between the United States, China, and India. We forget that the Indian economy is the third largest in the world now. According to projections formulated by PwC, global GDP will increase by 130% between 2016 and 2050. I can write that down in my prediction. In 2050, China will be the largest economy with 20% of global GDP. India will be second with 15%. The USA will be down to 12%, and Europe will lag behind with 9%. However, in our rapidly changing world, these projections and predictions may prove to be as wrong as Fukuyama's conclusion about the end of history. There are just too many variables. The outcome of growing competition between East and West will, as in the past, probably be determined by the effectiveness of their respective social and political systems. China, having survived the aberration of the Mao dynasty, is reverting to its traditional roots. Xi Jinping, with increasingly absolute power, is now the new emperor. The Communist Party is the new Mandarin class. China, with an ancient tradition of exam-based meritocracy, is betting that its system, based on economic freedom, political autocracy, and meritocracy, will outperform the American system based on economic, intellectual, and personal freedom, and the kind of popular democracy that can produce leaders of the caliber of George W. Bush and Donald Trump. India, the dark horse in the race, will soon have the world's largest population. It's now 1350 million, only 50 million behind China. Its free market democratic model provides advantages, but they may be complicated by India's enormous diversity and increasingly militant Hindu nationalism. According to Amartya Sen, the Indian economist, India's progress has also been hampered by its failure to invest sufficiently in social, educational, and health services for its enormous population. All this is presenting the United States and Europe with a seminal challenge. Will their social, political, and economic model be able to compete with the challenge from China and India? Much will depend on the degree to which they can revert to the principles of genuine economic and political freedom and social tolerance on which their phenomenal success during the past 2 centuries was based. It is promoting these values that libertarianism can make an essential contribution, not only to the United States and to Europe, but also here in South Africa. South Africa would be regarded by Aristotle as a corrupt and unenlightened democracy. However, we still enjoy considerable freedom guaranteed by our Constitution, and reasonably independent courts. Libertarians and everyone else concerned about the future of the country should guard against the possibility of our sliding into oligarchy and tyranny. In particular, they should defend freedom of speech against the local advocates of identity politics. They should defend property rights and oppose expropriation without compensation. They should support efforts to combat corruption and to adopt rational economic policies. They should oppose all forms of racism. And they should support the principles of freedom entrenched in our Constitution. In my view, we should revert to the libertarian principles of democratic freedom, merit-based competition, and social toleration that were so eloquently articulated by Pericles more than 2,400 years ago. However, of one thing we can be sure. While human society continues to exist, there will never be an end to history. Happy to answer any questions. Or
more than noisy enough. What do you think is the source of the rise of identity politics? In fact, only the last 5 or 6 years in the West. What is driving this almost mindless obsession with identity politics?
all people need belief systems. And I think with the collapse of traditional religion in the West in particular, people have focused on that same Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they've absolutized the core elements of that declaration into a new dogma with all of the attendant intolerances of doctrinal and dogmatic approaches.
Question. Thank you very much. My observation is just an observation and a question. The observation I would make is, for your consideration, the first libertarian I would make prior to Pericles, 1,000 years earlier, would be Moses, who introduced a wonderful constitution of no kings, private property, money system, etc., which is a great libertarian document. But
and not coveting your neighbor's ass.
yes, and private, and don't steal. And of course, God's admonition to them that please don't have a king over you because he'll steal everything that you've got. Just a question. Would you consider the idea of a Southern African equivalent to the European Union could be a step towards the kind of libertarian values of freedom? By that I mean, as the EU has a single currency system, borderless situation, is it practical to think of that in Southern Africa? You've had a lot of experience on the top of politics. You know how things work. Could that be a step towards greater freedom and greater economic growth in Southern Africa?
I think our principal challenge at the moment is not building the kind of federation that they have in Europe, which in itself has many problems. It is simply surviving as a democracy in the next 18 months. That is the challenge. And that challenge rests on our ability to abide by the fundamental rights in our Constitution.
Does this work? Dave, thank you very much for a wonderfully enlightening speech. I'm going to ask you a question that you're more than free, of course, to, as a libertarian, you're more than free to refuse to answer. But as somebody who was instrumental in the transformation from apartheid to a democratic society, you must have been alive to the kinds of considerations you've talked about today. For me, they look like a platform for liberalism rather than libertarianism, but I'm not particularly concerned with that aspect. What interests me is the extent to which, in crafting the checks and balances that the government did at the time, no doubt with your input, unless I'm being presumptuous, you were alive to these considerations. You felt that the checks and balances that you were putting in place would counteract the kind of corruption that you discern, and to what extent you think you failed, and to what extent you think you succeeded.
Good question. If you had asked me on the morning of the 2nd of February, 1990, before de Klerk made his speech, what I would choose, if I could see the way South Africa was today, I would have grabbed it with both hands. If you had told me that 25 years or 30 years after that speech, we would still all be here, we would have a functioning democracy, we would have a constitution that was pretty good, we would have courts that sometimes are impartial, I would have said, that is a lot better than the alternatives. The constitution that we negotiated did include checks and balances, and I think that everybody made major concessions in reaching the political compromise that it represented. But what you can't negotiate, what you can't legislate is human nature. And I'm afraid that that is the problem. Any constitution, no matter how good, will collapse if the leadership and the population do not support it in their action. And I think there's still plenty of people in the ANC who do support the Constitution. I think we see that there is that struggle at the moment. When we criticize what happened, we must remember that it was our courts, our investigative journalists, our civil society organizations that brought about the fall of a president, Jacob Zuma. And that's no mean achievement. So South Africa is always problematic. Every morning since I was 17 years old, I woke up and I worried about the future of the country. I don't think that is going to change. That is what it means to be a South African.
Hi. Thank you for a really informative and excellent presentation. So I was posed this question last night by one of our students who is attending, and it's been food for thought. I'm not sure that I'm going to express this effectively, but I'm going to do my best. But you were talking about what drives the identity politics. And I think that part of what drives the identity politics, especially in this country, is the sense of unfairness. That there are huge tracts of the population. We were talking about how, there is natural inequality in human beings. Nobody is really the same. But there are constraints on you being able to manifest the potential that you have as a human being to operate in a free market, to maximize your potential. That is, they are constrained by the limitations of things like poverty and malnutrition and so on. And so in this free market model, is there a place and is there a duty in your perspective for helping people to reach that point of equality of opportunity to manifest their potential without, not top down but bottom up?
Well, I believe that our failure to advance equality has been perhaps the single greatest failure of the new society. Our country, our new society, is based on fundamental, foundational principles, among them human dignity, the achievement of equality, the advancement of human rights and freedoms. And we have failed dismally to do anything about equality. We are a more unequal society now than we were in 1994. We support the provisions in Section 9(2) of the Constitution which mandate the state to take action to advance those people who have been discriminated against in the past with a view to promoting equality. But the state took consistently the wrong steps. Instead of addressing the needs of the most disadvantaged, 80%, 70% of the population, by providing decent education, by providing decent social services, by providing an economy that creates jobs, they failed to advance equality. Instead, they concentrated on affirmative action programs that simply enriched the top 10, 15% of the population. And for that reason, the Gini coefficient now within the black community is as high as it is in the country as a whole at 0.63. So it is a manifest failure. But the problem is not free market. The problem is incredible government incompetence, particularly in the failure to provide decent education to our people. And we spend 15,000 Rand per child per annum on education, but we get no value from that. So we should be angry about inequality, but we should not be angry about the free market system for that.
Dave,
Yeah.
I want to link back to the earlier question about the EU as applied to sub-Saharan Africa. The AU is pretty much modeled, in principle at least, on the EU. I mean, in practice, it takes a bit more bureaucracy than I think the AU is capable of. I've always had the feeling that the idea of the European Union in the early days, when it was the European Economic Community, was great. You know, borderless trade and so on, customs union, that's a great idea. Economic unity is great. Where they went wrong was with political unity. Do you get the same feeling about Africa, that in as much as the African Union idea enables free trade through Africa, it's great, but if we take the next step towards political union with an African parliament that actually has legislative powers in all various countries and so on, that would be a step too far?
I think it is a step too far. I think in reality, the principal challenge of many African states is to maintain their own internal coherence before they start entering into grandiose superstructural relationships across the continent. The real challenge is to make sure that they provide good governance for their people, security, the circumstances in which economic growth can take place, the circumstances in which corruption can be fought. I think those are the first challenges that confront most countries, including South Africa, in the African continent. Once we've got those things organized, we can think about federations and how we relate to the rest of the continent. In the meantime, the more we do away with trade barriers, the more interaction we have, the better. Let it happen organically. Increase travel between African countries so that if you're in the Ivory Coast, you don't have to fly to Paris to get to Lagos.
Thank you very much, Dave. Wonderful talk. I agreed with every single word that you said. Can I just put it to you, I think one of the big problems in the Western world, which you didn't mention, is there's just too much prosperity. There's too much security. People are too well off, and they can't cope with it, and it makes them very resentful. And the extreme example is this extraordinarily rich schoolgirl, Greta Thunberg. Now, she's living in some of the best climate we've had for centuries, with the best food crops we've ever had in the history of mankind, with carbon dioxide presenting no threat whatsoever to us, in fact, quite the opposite. And there she is, absolutely furious and indignant and fearful about her future, crossing the Atlantic in a carbon fiber yacht that cost 150 million rand, and then screaming and shouting in the United Nations about how you're taking away my future, and how dare you?
Well, was it de Rochefoucauld who observed that it takes much greater strength of character to deal with good fortune than to deal with bad fortune? And this I think is the problem that Ibn Khaldun referred to in his classical analysis of the psychical nature of states, that the people who found the state, the people who built up Europe from the ashes of the Second World War, had all of the requisite qualities needed for growth and to be able to sustain and create. But the third generation becomes debilitated. The third generation loses its motivation. The third generation becomes weak. So there's an element in that, but personally, you can burden me with as much prosperity as you like. I will try to develop the moral strength to deal with it.
Thanks for the speech. I have a point of disagreement with you on the education thing. The most literate country in Africa is still Zimbabwe. It's clearly not the education that is the issue. As you pointed out when you were commenting on the education as well, like I think we reached a point at one stage where we spend proportionally the most per child of any country in the world on education, and it has literally had an inverted yield now. We have schools that produce uncurious children now. They're literally worse off than they would have been just being left at home with absolutely no further input. The state is really like this. The state needs to get completely out of that business. I think the state needs to give up on trying to help. They need to give up on trying to help. Every single thing they touch has really just turned cancerous. And really, I don't feel that any further attempts for them to help is going to do anything more than what we've had so far. But that was a minor disagreement, actually. I have a question for you in terms of if you had to go back 30 years. Maybe you need a minute to think about this. If you could delete one or two things from the government or from the Constitution or somewhere, if you could just remove one or two things from 30 years ago to prevent specifically the rise of this version of the communist ANC that we're seeing at the moment, what would those one or two things be that you remove?
I don't think we dealt with the past effectively. We didn't have a proper system, negotiated system for dealing with the past. What we got with the TRC was simply an organization that gave official state imprimatur to the ANC's version of history, and that has very, very far-reaching implications. That's why you now have the widely held belief that whites stole all the land that they possess, where our president says that whites are not the rightful owners of land. I mean, it's a shocking thing to say, where our president says whites are burdened with original sin. And the original sin is that we came here. And the thing about original sin is that it is indelible, you can't wash it out. And it's a terrible thing to say about any community. So I think one of our biggest failures was to have a proper way of dealing with the past. Because The past is the elephant in the room in every interaction between black and white people in South Africa still. So as far as the education is concerned, I hold by my view that it's been our greatest single failure. It was Mugabe's greatest success. But we have churned out generations of young people who just simply have no prospect of getting a decent job. With a matric pass rate of 30% or 40% in 3 subjects. It is terrible. We have failed that generation, and I think that lies at the heart of a lot of the other problems in our society.
We can have 2 more questions, and then we have to... Sorry, Lord. Okay, we have to first go to this gentleman and that gentleman, but we're really running out of time. Otherwise, we're gonna have to cut our tea and stuff. So I do apologize, but we have to run a little bit of a tight ship.
Sure.
So I'm going to allow 2 questions and then a follow-up comment, and that's it for now. Sorry, you're part of the organizing team. I'm using my hypocrisy here. Keep it short, please.
The problem with our president, as you call him, is that he refers to the black section of the population as our people.
Yes.
And that, I think, manifests a very serious problem within the community. Firstly, I would suggest that rather than call him our president, call him the president. That's what he is. I do not lay claim to him as my president. But he also doesn't lay claim to me as a member of his society. When he speaks of our people, he doesn't speak of me as a white person, especially not as a white man. When he speaks of our land, he doesn't speak of my property that I have and that I've worked for throughout my career. But he speaks of the land which he's supposedly been stolen. But the real problem that we have in South Africa is not that we've got too much of any of the various good things that we've been talking about. It is that we've got too little of it. We don't have enough freedom, we don't have enough constitutions, we don't have enough rule of law, and the courts, though apparently ostensibly independent, do not have the level of independence that they should have, and indeed that they even once had. So we have too little of all of the things that we pretend to have, and too much of the communist revolutionary rhetoric. Now that communist revolutionary rhetoric goes under a very recognized name, which I've not heard, which you've not mentioned. And that is the National Democratic Revolution. No doubt you are aware of it. And I think that in a very competent and a very able speech it is something that you should perhaps have alluded to. Because the fundamental problem with the country at the moment is that it is still at policy level wedded to a communist manifesto. The National Democratic Revolution, to which President Ramaphosa has recommitted himself since having become president, is part of the agenda of the ANC, and it is a part of a communist agenda, and we can see it happening incrementally. So I'm afraid that is where the problem lies. The problem lies with ideology. It doesn't even lie with incompetence or
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, but my speech was not about South Africa. It was about freedom generally in the world. How many people here have read the ANC's strategy and tactics documents? You brave individual. You have to read them. You've got to go onto the ANC's website and you've got to plow through all of this doctrinaire stuff. Because as with Hitler and Mein Kampf, they say exactly what they intend to do. The National Democratic Revolution is the guiding ideology of the ANC. And I think our foundation was one of the first organizations to start warning people about the NDR as early as 2006. That it is a corrosive ideology with its roots deep in Marxism, and it is completely irreconcilable with the idea of a constitutional state. So one has always this dichotomy in everything that the ANC says, the superstructure of the constitutional state, the underlying reality of the National Democratic Revolution.
Yes, Dave. Andrew Kenny said he agreed with every word you said. If I may say that probably the first time anyone has said anything with which he agreed with every word. So consider this a feather in your cap. I did discuss with you last night, so I know you're not familiar with it, the economic strategy for South Africa document from Treasury and Tito Mboweni. But I did, I think, give you some idea of what's in it. You're familiar with it in detail. And I was wondering if you'd had any time to digest it overnight. And the point about it is this, for those who don't know. This document has been produced by the Treasury, which is, again, something with almost every word with which Andrew might even agree. But I wouldn't expect him to expect it, so I'm sure he hasn't looked at it. But nonetheless, the key parts of it are interesting. And for me, what's missing, and I'd like your take on how significant this is, given, as others might not know, the enormous work you've done on the ANC strategy and tactics document, for example. I encourage everyone to read Dave's analysis of it, which is truly seminal and outstanding. But the issue is this, that in the midst of all of this, the NDR and the strategy and tactics document, comes a document from the Treasury, which we know about the divisions within the ANC, but it took 2 years to prepare. It's obviously been completely familiarized to the cabinet and the president. Comes out this document that, to my mind, the most interesting parts are what's not in it. It does not mention BEE, expropriation without property, the WOAN, the Wireless Open Access Network, which would have been, it's approved by the cabinet, the full nationalization of the entire telecommunications sector into a kind of ESCOM for telecommunications. So we would, have got rid of Vodacom and MTN and so on. None of this is mentioned. The only reference to BEE is in the reference to removing red tape, that it makes it difficult to run businesses. It has some quite extraordinary proposals. One is a 25% reduction by every government department and agency of red tape within 5 years. It says there should be proper special economic zones of the kind you get in China, which Kerry Welsh, who happens to be with us, know all about. He's run factories there, the freest economies on earth. And so here we have a document that could have been produced by the Libertarians. Obviously you don't expect them to be pure, but it's an extraordinary document. And the absence of expropriation without compensation, BEE, except in a negative sense. And Martin Grassi over here, who fought this extraordinary case on non-extension of agreements to non-parties in the bargaining councils, it actually says that. It says the exemption of small business from the extension of bargaining council agreements. I don't know if Martin's aware of that, but it's quite an amazing thing to see there. So I think for those not familiar with it, it's worth reading for once in your life a government document. I'd like your take on your thoughts of the chances of it getting through. We obviously in the Free Market Foundation are trying to make it better and stronger and enhance it. But the big thing will be if it has any traction or any relevance. It seems to me extraordinarily good news for South Africa. I'd like to know if you've thought about it in the Klerk Foundation. And for those who don't know, Dave is a very formidable and knowledgeable analyst of South African affairs, and I'd certainly like his take on the significance of this, what seems to me to be an amazing document, goes completely against the tide of everything else, NDR, strategy and tactics, and much else.
Well, our view is that we support any positive thing that the government does. If Cyril Ramaphosa does something good, we say, hey, great, right on, keep up with it. The same with even aspects of the National Development Plan. We said, look, this is a lot better than we've had in the past, but it's irreconcilable with the National Democratic Revolution. And you guys have got to choose between the NDR and the National Development Plan. So we would axiomatically welcome Tito Mboweni's ideas and proposals here because they make sense, they're practical, and we need them. The question is, will it work? Will this become the policy of the government? I was very interested to hear yesterday that David Mabuza had thrown in his weight behind Tito's plan. So that's a good sign. But the seminal problem is that all of this is irreconcilable with the decisions taken by the ANC at Nasrec. So somewhere down the road, there's going to be a crunch between the Nasrec guys, the Zumaites, and the people who are pragmatists in the Ramaphosa government. Our role should be, I think, to support everything that's sensible, but not in such a manner that we give it the kiss of death. Thank you.
One last comment, Ivo, and then we're going to break for tea time.
Yeah, just a brief comment. Following on from what Klerk said about the Zimbabwean education system and the apparent paradox that great education in Zimbabwe, or the mythically great education in Zimbabwe, has not resulted in great economic performance. The Zimbabwe education system is a bit strange. They are very militaristic, subject to corporal punishment, etc. They're very good at rote learning, at remembering lists, at following recipes, at following instructions. There was very little in the Zimbabwe education system that taught people critical thinking, innovation, entrepreneurship, that sort of thing. So I think it's important to distinguish a good quality education from something that simply produces a lot of literate people who can follow instructions, which is under pain of punishment, which is what the Zimbabwe education system has done. And that may explain why it hasn't really done all that much for the Zimbabwean economy.
I would settle for literate people. However
yes, of course, literacy is not to be sniffed at.
However we get them. And I had the great pleasure of having had 2 Zimbabwean-trained lawyers working for the foundation. And I can assure you that there was no lack of critical thinking. They were very good because we appoint people only on merit, and it's disturbing that we only have female employees.
I think you can approach the tea time. Please, can I ask, we run about 10 minutes over time. I'm going to ask guys.